From Mark chapter 9, and we're going to begin reading in verse 38. "Teacher," said John, "we saw a man driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop, because he was not one of us." "Do not stop him," Jesus said. "No one does a miracle in my name and can in the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. I tell you the truth, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to Christ will certainly not lose his reward." I love this idea of Jesus saying, whoever is not against us is for us. It's actually sort of one of those statements that if you think about it for too long, it doesn't sound true anymore. Like if you really think about it, well that's not really true. If anybody's not against us, that doesn't necessarily mean they're for us, right? But I love that he did this because in the context of this passage, obviously the disciples get a little territorial. And I don't know if you've ever been in this situation where it's sort of salt in the wound when someone else can do something that you're struggling to do, but they're on the wrong team. They play for the wrong team, or they wear the wrong colors, or they're under the wrong banner. It's like insult to injury, right? It's too close to home because not only are they playing for the other team, but they're having more success than you are, and so you can understand the disciples were a little bit insecure. And so they come to Jesus and they're like, "Hey, this guy, he was doing good, but he's not one of us, so we told him to knock it off." It's just a funny story, right, of the disciples' humanity. And one of the things I love about the disciples is that pre-Pentecost, before that they had the spirit of power and became the apostles, they were sort of like the stooges, right? They were always sort of messing up or missing the point. And one of the things I love about how the gospel is written is that often the gospel writer lets us, by viewing the disciples messing up or getting it wrong or getting confused, it lets us feel a little bit superior, like, "Oh, those silly disciples." When in reality, the disciples are us, right? Without the advantage of 20/20 hindsight, we find ourselves in the voice of the disciples, missing the point. So when Jesus says, "Don't stop him. Anyone who's not against us is for us," which is a very sort of gracious and ironic posture by Jesus. And it makes me think that there is an art to knowing the difference between the exception to the rule and the exception that proves the rule. So the exception to the rule is sort of one of those things that life mostly works this way, or let's say faith mostly works this way, or whatever the topic is. It's fairly predictable or logical or in some semblance of order, but there's always an exception, right? So you always have to just factor in, there's always going to be an outlier, and it's just the exception to the rule, right? And there's no big deal, it just is what it is. My favorite thing is when the exception proves the rule. And this is something we are really struggling with in our society today, is that because we live in this either-or culture of conflict, we don't know what to do when something doesn't fit in our black and white box. So I really like to ask, is it an exception to the rule, or is it the exception that proves the rule? Because when I was a youth pastor, one of the things I had the hardest time convincing my youth of is that because if you've ever had teenagers, by the way, they're not always great at knowing what grace is. Teenagers aren't always the most gracious, right? Because of the way their brains are forming, they get locked in like, is this a rule? Is this a rule? Because if it is, I'm going to break it, right? But then I'll be furious if you break it, right? But I want to know where the boundaries are. And so when I was a youth pastor and I would make an exception, let's say a kid was having a really bad day and they did something that was not acceptable, but we showed them grace, right? We gave them a little grace. I had to be careful that the rest of the kids in the youth group didn't think that that was a new precedent, right? So I had to introduce them to this idea that it's the exception that proves the rule. And grace is a tough thing right? In a culture of conflict, grace is a tough thing to know. Like, okay, hold on, that guy, he's not one of us. We sort of like what he's up to. Do we let him go? Do we say anything, right? Is that acceptable? And so I love that Jesus takes this gracious, ironic posture, that it's the exception that proves the rule. And he says, look, if you even give a cup of water to somebody who's thirsty in my name, that won't go unnoticed, right? That's good. We should definitely take part in that.